Now, I'm Dan Gurin. I'm an engineer with Civic Actions. Don't specialize in display engineering, but getting better at it. Sometimes I'm a Drupalcamp Asheville organizer, July 13th and 14th. If you want to come up, cool off. This summer. On Twitter, I'm at dgurin. Everywhere else, I'm Dan Gur. And yeah. So we're going to talk about test-driven development today, behavior-driven with Behat, and a little bit of visual regression testing, and then also talk about unit testing with PHPUnit. So the Behat Drupal extension is a pretty good way to go for your site building and configuration sorts of activities, especially if you're using just core and contrib. A lot of the unit tests are already built into those, so you can just focus on Behat. This is where you can define your functionality that's specific to your Drupal site, and it's in plain language, so regular people who are not developers can read it. This Behat Drupal extension, it includes a lot of common scenarios for things like, or common steps for if you're, say, logging in or creating content, things like that. It's great for when you're making changes and updates to your site to make sure that you didn't break anything. So typically, like if I don't have a Behat test and I break something, I didn't even know that I broke it, and the client will come back and be like, "Hey, this is broken," and be like, "Oh, that's a surprise. I guess we should write a Behat test for that." So, and it's also extensible. So if you went to Angie's talk this morning, you saw this screen. This is kind of the basics of how a Behat test should look. The feature is like a high-level type of user story. Scenarios are a collection of steps that would be similar to what you would take if you were doing manually testing, but this is automated. And there can be multiple scenarios in one feature. These keywords given when, then will start all of your steps. And you can also use the keywords and but. They pretty much all do the same thing, and then the text afterwards will be what will really define your step. If you go to make your first scenario and it just totally doesn't work, try putting @API on the line before your scenario, and that'll kick in the Drupal driver probably, and it'll work. Just a little tip there. So tags can be used to define which driver. Like I said, the @API is used for the Drupal driver, or maybe the Drush driver, depending on how you define it in your configuration. You can also add a JavaScript tag if you need to use JavaScript in your test. You can use the tags for groups, so if you just want to test your database or forms or whatever set of functionality, you can do that separately. And you can also get hooks, so you can have the after scenario, for instance. It would run that after every scenario. The app before node create would always run before a node is created. Quite logically.
Those last two, are they specific to like a feature or through all your tests? Specific scenario?
No, it's, I guess if you wanted to have something run, each time after a scenario, for instance, maybe maybe you had like a special cleanup that you wanted to run, might be a use case, or I don't know if you have other.
So the before node create corresponds with a PHP function that does something.
Yeah. Well. Yeah. And I think that you can run a scenario before a node create too.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Right. Okay.
So node create being the hook.
Yeah, I mean, if it was Drupal 7, that would be the hook. So here, the driver's black box is out of the box. There are no privileges. It's if you don't put a tag above your scenario, you'll get black box by default. And it's if you don't require authentication, that would be good to use. The add API, like I said, will be for the Drupal or Drush drivers. The Drush driver you can run it on a different server. There's also an advantage for that. And the Drupal driver has most of the steps for the Behat Drupal extension. So that's, I think, what's used most commonly. All right, so if you've ever created a node in Drupal 8 and had JavaScript on and you've started creating the title, you might notice that the machine name is automatically getting created while you're doing that, and that's JavaScript. So if you don't have JavaScript turned on, it won't do that, so you'd have to manually add the machine name, and it's would be if you didn't do it, then you wouldn't really get any feedback. It would fail silently. And so this is just a little tip where I was creating these tests and I was wondering why they weren't working, and this is why. So if you run into that, the machine name becomes a required field when JavaScript is off. So give that a try. To see what the page would look like with JavaScript off, you can do this in Chrome DevTools. Just click on the little menu item there and get to the settings, and then you can just check this disable JavaScript checkbox, and that way you'll be able to see what the page looks like to Behat with JavaScript off. You can do comments, just like the hashtag at any point in the line, and then that will comment out. If you're using most fancy editors, you can use the Control/ or Command/ on a Mac to comment out multiple lines. Can be nice for debugging and to, if you're testing things, you don't want to run through a billion lines, you can comment some lines out. It kind of speeds things up. This is cool background and tables. So if you start your feature out with a background, you can create these. You can create content that will happen for each scenario. So it's good for, here's like an example with pages, users, get some groups, memberships. I'm pretty sure I stole this from Dcan. And yeah, it's pretty nice.
Do you just put that above the scenario in the file?
Yeah, you just start it with this background colon, and then that will apply to all of the following scenarios. So this slide is demonstrating that background concept and also tables, which are commonly used together to do this trickery. The tables allow you to fill out multiple fields for entities. All right. So contexts, there are a lot that are included with the Behat Drupal extension. The Drupal raw functionality does a lot of the heavy lifting here with the kind of the core entities. There's also Mink, which handles regions and forms. The markup tags are like this is tags as in like HTML tags, not the @ tags that we were talking about before. And the markup also includes classes and attributes in the HTML. Messages are like the Drupal messages that you might see at the top of the page or in your logs. And the drush context allows you to call drush commands directly. And you can make custom context as well. This is pretty nice ability here. So how I like to do it is, write the step in the plain Gurin language first, and then run the test, see it fail, and then it will generate this little snippet here that you can just copy into the feature context file. And by default, it'll say throw new pending exception. So when you run your test, you'll see that pending exception is thrown. So you can just delete that exception, add in the code that you want to have in your context, and then test again to see if it works. And within the function there, you can just use regular, object-oriented PHP, Behat, Mink, and Drupal programming conventions, depending on what you're trying to do. You can use arguments in the custom context as well. So for here, I create a web form with :arg1, so I could call the web form whatever I want in my step there, and then that gets passed into the function, checks if it's not empty, and creates a web form with the ID of whatever the variable that you passed in is. Here's an example of another custom context that I thought was interesting to show. If you want to edit the current entity, you basically want to add /edit to the end of the URL. So here you can use the get session function and get the current URL, and then just basically add /edit to there, and then say visit that new path, and there you are at the edit for an entity. And here's kind of like a combination where we're using this to store the URL property in the object. So we get the current URL and save it to this URL, so we can come back to it at a later time. So here we're visiting this URL. This I used in a case where I was creating content item, and I wanted to come back to it later, logged in as a different user, but I wasn't sure like what the node ID was going to be. So I just saved it and was able to come back to it later without, trying to guess and probably being wrong. So for debugging, in steps you can, there's print the current URL, print last response. Those are Behat steps that you can use out of the box. You can create your own as well. Print R is your friend. If there's no, if variable is empty with print R, it just won't show anything. So something to be aware of. There's also the ability to have it grab screenshots when it fails, and you can also run Behat just starting from a line number by doing the Behat command from the command line, colon, the line number, if you don't want to run all of your steps.
Behat is a PHP-based thing. Has anyone tried, have you heard of anyone using PHP and Xdebug to debug Behat tests or anything?
The question is about using PHP and Xdebug to debug Behat.
Yeah.
Sounds reasonable. I suppose you could do that. I've not heard of it, but yeah. I mean, I guess I'm just thinking like getting the Xdebug would be interesting. Like getting an Xdebug set up for that would be fun. Yeah, that's interesting. I'll look into that. I've not heard of it, but has anyone else heard of that? I don't know. It's a good idea.
Seems like if you set a breakpoint, then it would stop there, right? If you set, I guess you can't set a breakpoint in your scenario YAML file or whatever. Is that kind of the issue?
Well, it would be in the feature context.php, and you could use that for debugging
Right.
potentially. Yeah.
That's what I was thinking.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I don't know if things are going to be that crazy where it would justify that, but maybe.
I mean, if somebody already had the configuration set up, you could just slap in a PHP store.
Right.
It would be using print R. So.
Right. Okay. Yeah, I'll check that out. Maybe that's the way to go. So you can also extend the Behat extension, and this is the one for Drupal 8, and it has all of these things in it. So this is an extension of the extension. It has all these extra things, all these extra context in them. So you can do these fun things. There's also an extension for Drupal 7. It's a little bit different. It's easy to find if you want to. Yeah. You can have subcontext, so this would be for Contrib and custom projects. I don't see a ton of this, but it is possible to to add them to your modules and themes. There's documentation in the Behat extension docs for that, if you want to do it, if you're a project maintainer or contributor of some sort. You can also contribute to the Behat Drupal extension itself. There's good documentation on doing that, as well as Behat also directly. So all open source stuff. Want to touch on visual regression testing a little bit. It's really good to easily implement really wide coverage without putting a lot of thought into it. You basically take some snapshots of the site before and after changes, and you can see it'll basically take a diff, and you can also use it for updates. Maybe you're making updates and you actually do want to see changes, so you want to see that your changes were there, and the visual regression test can tell you, yeah, this is different. Here's kind of how it works. It takes these two pictures, the after and before. I guess the before should probably be before, right? But and then the after, the purple shows you the diff there, which, if you're just looking at the two separately, kind of hard to see, but when you look at the diff, you can, clearly see in the purple, where this button is in a different place because the line has broken, and things like that. So how this works is the intersection over union, IOU, and it's a number between 1 and 0, 1 being the same and 0 being not the same. And so you can set your threshold anywhere within there to say, this is how much tolerance of difference I have for things to change. You can also set this, just to look at a certain region. So, like, if you could do it, by region, or you could just say, like, I'm not concerned with the header or footer. I just want to see the content area, and just show me the changes there. So, all right. So that's visual regression testing. We're going to take a look at unit testing, and this is with PHPUnit. This can be a pretty good way to go if you're doing custom code. It's fast, cheap, and it can be a lot more granular. These are the off the screen there. These are the different classes that Drupal 8 ships with. For the unit test, it just extends the PHPUnit test case. There is actually no Drupal involved. You don't even have to have a Drupal site running. You can just run this with PHPUnit, and it only requires the code. Next, you'll be at extending the kernel test base, and that's where Drupal is bootstrapped, and you need to have a database, but it's more like it's at the install screen, so you don't have any config or modules installed or anything like that. You have to get all that going within your kernel test. And then there's a browser test base, which can be typically more of a functional test. This is fully booted. You need a web server to do that, and you can slap JavaScript on top of that, which uses Phantom.js if you need to have JavaScript going for your test. So this is an example of a unit test case, just pretty simple. We see that we are extending the unit test case, and we're starting our function name with test. That tells PHPUnit this is a test. And then we have an assertion here, and it's basically testing that 1 equals 1. So hopefully this returns true. Some of the different assertions, there's equals and same. Equals is allows you to compare different objects, but the same, it would have to be like the same object. can assert true or false. There's a bunch of other assertions that you can look up in the PHPUnit documentation, and there's a link there. I'll put these slides up on the camp node so people can check them out if they want. And the kernel secret recipe for making a kernel test is doing the setup first, and then some config, and then you can move on with your kernel test. You need to recreate any environmental conditions that are necessary for your test. So the setup happens at the beginning of the class. You call the parent setup first, so you can inherit any setup that's needed from the parent. And this setup will apply to all of the test functions that follow in that class. For installation, you can do the schema, entity schema, and config, and how that plays out here. You see here's the setup function called the parent setup, and here's installing the schema. You just can call the module and then the tables that you want to install for that module. If you're installing an entity schema, it's a little simpler. You can just say the entity type ID, and for installing config, you can just say the name of the module, and it will install the config for that module. Here's kind of a cool thing that we do to install fields, and it's a little bit later. We'll talk about a trait which you can use to do this a little bit more easily. Get it from configuration management, and then create the field storage and then the field itself. It's a nice little pattern here. Basically just parse the config file and create the field storage and save it, and do a similar thing to create the field itself. Here's how you enable modules. Just pretty easy. Add the module names to the modules array. This is for kernel and functional tests. So with the functional tests, just like we said, enable modules. You have access to Passenger because you have the web server going, and you also have web assert. So here's an example of functional test, and it basically it extends the browser test base, and you're basically going to the home page here. Your path is nothing, and you're saying that asserting that the status code is equal to 200, which means it's okay, and that a link exists on the page called blog, so you can test for things like that. To put JavaScript on top of that, you can either execute or evaluate the JavaScript. Execute returns the value, evaluate does not. And there are some different methods that you can use there that are showing up frequently in a lot of other JavaScript tests. You can also create the screenshot and get the Drupal settings and do some extra assertions here. These are pretty common to assert if an element is visible or if a JavaScript condition exists. It only runs for 10 seconds, so if the condition takes more than 10 seconds to become true, you could, I guess, get a false negative. And with assert session, these can be used along with that. It's pretty typical, so you can have it wait. You can wait for Ajax to finish. Things like waiting for autocomplete and other such JavaScript-y things. Test doubles are a pretty cool part of PHPUnit. You don't have to actually instantiate the object. You can pretty much fake it and just pass in the values that are necessary for your test. This is done with mock objects. So you basically can just get the mock builder for the class that you want to do, that you want to create the mock for, and you disable the original constructor so it does not actually create a web form object. You set the methods that you need returned. In this case, it's just an ID, and then you get the mock. And then you set expect here is the matcher. There are some different matchers that you can look up, but after that you will say the method that you want and the return value that it's expecting, and there you have web form ID of a test web form, and you're good to go. So traits, kind of a standard PHP type of code here. It can be reused in classes, and it's also good for grouping sets of methods. It cannot be instantiated, of course. Here's an example of a reflection trait, and this is used if you want to test a class that is protected or private. You basically invoke the method and pass in these, pass in the object, the method name, and the parameters, and a new object is made, and then passes in that method, and along with the parameters here, you are able to test the non-public functions. So here's kind of how that looks, or how it might look. You would basically just use the reflection trait within the class and invoke the method and pass in the parameters that you want here, and it would allow you to test it. There's also data providers. This allows you to run the same test on different sets of data. So here we see we have 3 parameters that we're passing in here, A, B, and sum. Just a simple example here. So when we add A and B, we get the sum. 1 plus 2 equals 3, 4 plus 5 equals 9, 7 plus 8 does not equal 9, so this last one would fail. These first two would pass. You can do this with an associative array, and that's cool because the test would return the key of the array, so you can kind of keep track of what it is that you're testing that way. Typing. Again, debugging with printar or maybe even xdebug. And you can get screenshots and reports to send out to a different folder. And you get messages back when it fails to run the tests. You can run it from the command line. PHPUnit's probably in your like vendor bin directory. You can add arguments. If you use Bolt, there's a cool little way to do that. You can run it from your continuous integration. You can use groups to run only certain groups. And here we'll see that typically the results that you'll get back is a dot for pass, an E for an error, an F for a failure. You might also get an R or an S for risky or skipped. Or an I for incomplete, but those are pretty rare. So the happy and sad pass, there's a tendency to just only want to test when things are going right, but you also want to test things that shouldn't work. So like if you had a password policy, you could test putting in a password that didn't meet your policy and see that it didn't work. So writing tests for that ensures that things are working well. And if it expects an exception in that case, you can put in this expect exception so that your test won't just like die and like stop testing everything else. If you're expecting a sad path, use that expect exception. You can also use base classes for common setups, and you can nest those. And I think that's it. So if we have time for an open discussion, if there are any questions or comments.
Can you specifically exclude, with the visual regression testing and CSS something or other, can you specifically exclude classes? You said you could only test certain sections of the page.
Yeah, regions.
But can you test an entire page, all of the regions, but exclude like the text of a date time block or something like that?
Yeah, you can exclude regions or different parts of the page that would change, are expected to change.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
I don't know if you covered this in the beginning because I missed it, but when do you generally run your tests? I mean,
Yeah.
Ideally, you would do it at the beginning.
Right. Yeah. So.
Practically speaking.
Yeah. So the idea of test-driven development is where you write the test first, and it fails because the code doesn't exist or the configuration to make it pass. I mean, the reality of that is that it's difficult to do, and it's like it's a bit of like a challenge to conceive of how it's going to be.
You basically have to have everything spec'd out to be able to do that.
Yeah, well, but that's a good thing because it makes it so that you know what you're doing and you know what you're not doing, so you don't just like keep on working on a ticket or a feature beyond what you're supposed to. So it sets this limit, like you just work on it until the test passes.
When you can run the wouldn't you want to write your tests based on your requirements? As far as behavior driven, say, okay, at least my customer wants, when, let's say logging, okay, you do logging, when I log in, I actually get, a proper return code, whatever that. So whatever the requirements are, okay, let's say, okay, when I press this button, it's going to add up all of the stuff on my page or whatever. Okay?
Yeah.
So that's part of the requirements documentation for the actual project, right? So isn't that a good starting point on doing your testing?
Yeah, I mean, you can call them requirements, or it could be a good user story. Works really well in the Behat Gurin syntax, and it tries to enforce that kind of development. So yeah, for sure that you don't have to test every single thing, but just test the most important things. If your site is like trying to make money, test that. If it's trying to get people to sign up, make sure that's working. And
in practice, though, is that how you actually do it, or because I've found that it never works for me personally.
I mean, I don't do it every time, but I try to do it. I think it's it's a good way to operate. But I can't say that I do it every single time.
With that visual regression testing, I know it checks the differences in the dimensions X, Y, so on and so forth. Is there a way to limit the algorithm so it's only looking in the X direction, it's only looking in the height or the width direction, that sort of thing?
Yeah, I mean, in Drupal that'll typically be done by the regions, but if you want to get into the config, you can dial it in pretty much. If you want to get into pixels, you can do that too.
So for someone who's never played with visual regression testing, what is the range that most sites operate in as far as that goes?
That is a fine question. I actually have no idea. I would say it depends on what your threshold is for, differences. I'm not sure. Does anyone know if, like, for visual regression testing, what a typical threshold range might be? A number between 0 and 1. 25. Yeah, I'll try to look that up and put it on the slide. If I can figure it out. I don't know if maybe there's best practice.
It dials itself in pretty rapidly because you don't want a bunch of false alarms, so you just keep ratcheting it up until you stop getting false alarms.
Yeah. It's a good way to do it. Yeah.
So, I've been using Behat testing for the last few months with a particular client.
Yeah.
2 quick tips that we ran across. One was we beat our heads against the wall for a long time because none of the logged-in tests were working, and we realized it was like, I think it was a CAPTCHA or something. The Behat was not getting through the CAPTCHA, so we had to just turn off CAPTCHA and then we could run our tests. But we beat ourselves up for a long time before we figured that out. The other one, I don't know if you use it, is there is a script, sort of an add-on that you can use that'll generate an HTML file when your Behat test fail. I don't know if you talked about that, I don't remember.
I don't think I talked about that, but yeah,
That's so helpful.
Yeah. Okay, so just for the microphone here, I don't know if we caught it, but turn off CAPTCHA because sometimes Behat can't get through that for logging in, and then also when Behat fails, there's an extension that will save the HTML of the page. So I mentioned the screenshot, but you can also get the HTML of the page, which can be helpful if you're looking for something in particular.
I know zero about Behat, but I'm currently using Casper.js, but I saw Phantom.js pop up on your slide. and I use Phantom CSS for image comparison. So do you know, like Behat, it'll do. Does you think it uses? It looks like it's very similar to Phantom CSS.
Behat doesn't do the visual regression testing. That's a different technology. So yeah, I think Phantom.
What is it that you use?
I think it's WebDriver CSS was the open source one.
Oh,
it's
okay.
it's a little ancient, like a couple years old, but it's open source. So.
And Behat, it's like a command line. You run it on a command line or something, or is it a third server that watches your server?
You can run it on the command line. If you use the Drush driver, you can run it on a different server. You can set it up in your continuous integration.
Cool.
All right. Thank you.